What happens when a moment of thoughtlessness spirals into a life-altering journey of accountability and resilience? This is the story of Zara, a brilliant teenage artist, and Grace, a seasoned teacher who makes a cruel mistake that changes everything. A single incident in a classroom unleashes waves of humiliation for Zara and a reckoning for Grace, forcing both to confront uncomfortable truths about prejudice, power, and the cost of inaction. As Zara rises above her pain to become a voice for change, Grace is left grappling with the weight of her actions. But will either of them find closure? And what does redemption look like when trust has been shattered? Stick around to discover how their intertwined journeys unfold in ways that will leave you inspired and deeply moved. If this story intrigues you, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more emotionally charged narratives that explore the human experience. Let us know your thoughts as the story unfolds. We'd love to hear your perspective. Now let's dive in. Grace Nolan straightened the rows of desks in her classroom, her gaze flickering over the cheerful posters she'd pinned to the walls. Progress is impossible without change. Read 1, featuring a stylized portrait of Maya Angelou. It was the first day of school at Westfield High, and Grace was feeling good. She prided herself on fostering an inclusive, warm classroom environment where students felt seen and heard. But as she rehearsed her welcome speech, her eyes drifted toward her reflection in the glass of the classroom door. She adjusted her necklace and smiled. Grace had always considered herself a fair, progressive teacher. In her mind, her role wasn't just about teaching literature, it was about preparing students for the world, teaching them compassion and resilience. What she didn't realize was how shallow her self-perception was. The bell rang. Her students filed in, some chattering nervously, others clutching schedules as if their lives depended on it. Grace greeted them warmly, her eyes scanning for new faces. She paused when she saw Zara Taylor, a petite black girl with tight curls tied back neatly. Zara hesitated in the doorway, glancing around before sliding into a desk in the back. Grace made a mental note to watch her. Quiet students often needed extra encouragement. The Taylors had moved to the suburb of Westfield over the summer, drawn by its reputation for top-tier schools. Dr. Charles Taylor, Zara's father, had recently been appointed principal of Westfield High, a role he accepted with a mission to make the school a place where every student, regardless of background, could thrive. Zara, however, was less enthused about the change. She missed her old school in Atlanta, where she had friends who understood her quirks and a community that felt like home. On her first day, she felt the weight of being the new girl more than ever. She slid in her seat in Grace's class, hoping to remain invisible. When Grace handed out a syllabus and began a discussion on the books they'd be reading, Zara's ears perked up. She loved literature and was excited to hear that they'd be studying To Kill a Mockingbird later in the semester. But as Grace talked about the importance of understanding racism from every angle, Zara couldn't help but notice the subtle edge in her tone. It wasn't overt, but something about it felt off. Grace's best friend and fellow teacher, Linda, often teased her about her social justice warrior persona. Over lunch, Grace liked to discuss her efforts to diversify the curriculum or her success in leading discussions on tough topics like privilege and prejudice. To outsiders, Grace appeared enlightened. But to Linda, who had known Grace since their teacher training days, it was clear Grace lacked self-awareness. "Not every moment has to be a teachable one, Grace," Linda said one afternoon. "Sometimes kids just need someone to listen." "Ils doivent listen," Grace retorted. "But if we don't teach them to think critically, who will?" Linda sighed, but didn't push further. She knew Grace meant well, even if her methods sometimes bordered on performative. Zara struggled to adjust. At lunch, she sat alone for the first week, watching the other kids group up effortlessly. She tried to talk to a few classmates, but the conversations were polite and brief. She missed her old friends, her routines, and the familiarity of a place where she wasn't just that new girl. The only bright spot in her day was Mia, a bubbly girl in her chemistry class who introduced herself with an infectious smile. Mia made Zara feel a little less alone. They began sitting together at lunch, bonding over shared interests in art and anime. At home, Zara's parents encouraged her. "Give it time," her mother said. People will see how amazing you are. Zara smiled but wasn't convinced. High school wasn't known for rewarding patience. Dr. Charles Taylor faced his own challenges. As one of the few black principals in the district, he knew the scrutiny he'd be under. He also knew the importance of building trust with the faculty while advocating for systemic change. In his first staff meeting, he introduced initiatives aimed at fostering inclusivity, implicit bias training, a review of disciplinary practices, and mentorship programs for marginalized students. The reactions were mixed. Some teachers, like Linda, were receptive. Others, like Grace, felt defensive but hid it behind polite nods. Dr. Taylor wasn't naive. He knew change would be slow, but he was determined to plant the seeds. Grace noticed Zara more and more in class. She wasn't disruptive, but there was a quiet confidence in her that Grace couldn't quite pin down. When Zara answered questions, her insights were sharp and thoughtful. But Grace often found herself correcting Zara's tone or asking her to elaborate more than she did with other students. She told herself she was pushing Zara to excel, but Zara often left class feeling singled out. One day, after Zara shared a personal connection to a story they were reading, Grace responded with a comment that felt dismissive. "That's interesting, but let's focus on the text," she said, moving on without acknowledgement. Zara felt a pang of frustration, but bit her tongue. By the end of the first month, tensions simmered under the surface. Zara was slowly finding her footing, but her interactions with Grace left her wary. Grace, meanwhile, continued to see herself as the hero of her classroom, oblivious to the growing cracks in her approach. Dr. Taylor, ever observant, began to notice subtle signs of tension between his daughter and Grace, but he decided to let things play out, trusting Zara to navigate her own challenges. Unbeknownst to them all, a storm was brewing, one that would force each of them to confront uncomfortable truths. It was a Friday morning, and Zara woke up feeling uneasy. Her cramps had been persistent, and she had barely slept. She shoved an extra pad into her backpack before heading out the door, telling herself the day would pass quickly. In Grace's class, the students were preparing for a group activity. Zara felt a familiar warmth spreading, and panic set in. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, trying to assess the damage without drawing attention to herself. When she glanced down, her heart sank. A crimson stain had formed on the back of her light jeans. Zara's first instinct was to escape, but before she could move, a boy in the row behind her noticed. Zara," he started, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby students. Grace turned from the whiteboard, her eyes landing on Zara. Her brows furrowed for a moment, then lifted in what Zara could only interpret as amusement. "Oh dear," Grace said, her tone light but cutting. "Did you forget it's that time of the month?" The class erupted into stifled laughter. Some students averted their eyes, clearly uncomfortable, while others snickered openly. Zara's face burned. She wanted to disappear. "Maybe you should, take care of that," Grace added with a half-smile, gesturing toward the door. Zara bolted from the room, her legs shaking as she made her way to the nearest restroom. She locked herself in a stall, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't just the humiliation, it was the feeling of being reduced to a joke by someone who was supposed to support her. Zara called Mia from the bathroom, her voice trembling. Mia arrived minutes later with a sweater, which Zara tied around her waist. "You don't have to go back," Mia said firmly. "Let's just go to the nurse." But Zara couldn't bring herself to leave the safety of the stall. "What's the point?" she whispered. "Everyone's already laughing at me." Meanwhile, in the classroom, Grace carried on with the lesson, oblivious to the gravity of her actions. She rationalized the incident as a harmless moment of levity, even telling herself she was teaching Zara a lesson in resilience. The students' reactions, however, told a different story. Whispers spread, and soon, the event was being recounted in exaggerated detail across the school. By lunch, Zara's humiliation had gone viral within the school. A classmate had posted a vague but inflammatory message on social media. "When your teacher roasts you for your period, Westfield drama cringe." The post quickly garnered comments, some defending Zara and others mocking her further. Zara's name wasn't mentioned, but it didn't take long for people to connect the dots. When Zara saw the post on Mia's phone, Her chest tightened. "Why would someone do this?" she asked. "Because people suck," Mia replied, scrolling through the comments. "But look, some people are sticking up for you." Zara didn't feel comforted. The damage was done. The post had made her shame public in a way she couldn't control. The school day ended without Grace giving Zara another thought. When Linda mentioned the incident during their shared planning period, Grace waved it off. "Teenagers are dramatic," she said. "It wasn't a big deal." Linda frowned. "But you know how sensitive kids can be about that stuff. Maybe you should check in with her." Grace shrugged. "If she has a problem, she can talk to me. I'm not a mind reader." Linda let it drop, but the interaction left her uneasy. Grace's unwillingness to reflect was becoming a pattern. That evening, Zara sat at the dinner table, pushing her food around her plate. Her parents noticed immediately. "Rough day?" her mom asked. Zara hesitated, glancing at her father. She didn't want to burden him, knowing how much pressure he was under in his new role. But when her mother pressed, she broke down and told them everything. Dr. Taylor's face darkened as he listened. "And your teacher said nothing to stop it?" he asked. "She was the one who started it," Zara replied bitterly. Dr. Taylor exchanged a glance with his wife. "We'll handle this," he said firmly. "But for now, focus on yourself. You don't have to face this alone." The following Monday, Dr. Taylor met privately with Grace. He addressed the incident without naming Zara, framing it as a broader issue of classroom culture. "It's important that our students feel supported, especially in vulnerable moments," he said. "Even small comments can have a big impact." Grace nodded politely, but felt defensive. "Of course, I understand, but teenagers can be overly sensitive. Sometimes they need to learn to laugh at themselves." Dr. Taylor didn't press further, but his disappointment was palpable. He decided to monitor the situation closely, knowing that real change would require more than one conversation. Zara spent the next week navigating a minefield of stares and whispers. Some students offered kind words, while others made snide comments under their breath. Mia remained a constant source of support, but even her optimism couldn't erase Zara's growing anxiety. One evening, Zara sat in her room, sketching to calm her nerves. As her pencil glided over the paper, she thought about how much she hated feeling powerless. "Maybe I can't control what people say," she thought, "but I can control how I respond." The realization gave her a small but meaningful sense of strength. By the end of the week, the fallout from the incident had reached a boiling point. Grace remained oblivious to the extent of the damage, while Zara grappled with the emotional scars. Dr. Taylor, determined to address the deeper issues at play, began laying the groundwork for systemic change. Unbeknownst to them all, the events set in motion were only the beginning of a larger reckoning. The Monday after the incident, Westfield High buzzed with tension. In the hallways, students whispered as Zara passed, some offering sympathetic glances while others stifled laughter. The online post had grown beyond the school, sparking debates in local community forums. Some commenters condemned the teacher's actions, while others dismissed Zara as overly sensitive. In her English class, Zara kept her head down, feeling the weight of every gaze. Grace, oblivious to the emotional turmoil, began the lesson without acknowledging Zara. Zara's stomach churned as Grace's words blurred into background noise. That evening, Zara vented to Mia on the phone. "It's like she doesn't even care," Zara said. "How can someone be so cold?" "She probably thinks she did nothing wrong," Mia replied. "Adults can be clueless sometimes." The incident reached a turning point when a student anonymously posted a detailed account of what had happened, naming both Zara and Grace. The post included damning commentary. "This is what happens when teachers don't understand their power. Grace Nolan should be ashamed." The post went viral locally, garnering hundreds of reactions. Zara's phone buzzed nonstop with messages, some supportive and others cruel. She turned it off, overwhelmed by the flood of attention. At school, the post widened divisions. Some students rallied around Zara, praising her courage for enduring such humiliation. Others sided with Grace, arguing that Zara was making a mountain out of a molehill. Teachers were split too, while some quietly criticized Grace. Others viewed the backlash as unfair. Zara's anxiety began to affect her schoolwork. Once a confident student, She now hesitated to speak up in class, fearing judgment. She spent more time in the art room, finding solace in her sketches, which grew darker in tone. One afternoon, Dr. Taylor found her in the art room after school. "How are you holding up?" he asked gently. "Sara saruget. I don't know. It's like, I don't even want to be here anymore." Dr. Taylor's heart sank. "You're stronger than you think," he said. "But you don't have to go through this alone. If you want to talk to someone professionally, I can set that up." Zara hesitated but nodded. The idea of therapy felt daunting, but she knew she needed help. Meanwhile, Grace faced her own challenges. Though she dismissed the online backlash publicly, it began to gnaw at her. Parents started emailing complaints, questioning her judgment and professionalism. At lunch, her usual group of colleagues kept their conversations brief, leaving her feeling isolated. Linda finally confronted Grace. "You need to take this seriously," she said. "Have you even talked to Zara?" Grace bristled. "Why should I? I'm not the villain everyone's making me out to be. It was a joke, nothing more." Linda shook her head. "Sometimes perception is reality. Whether you meant harm or not, Zara's hurting. Isn't that worth addressing?" Grace waved her off, but Linda's words lingered. At the next staff meeting, Dr. Taylor addressed the issue head-on. Without naming Zara, he spoke about the importance of creating a safe environment for all students. "Our words have power," he said. "What may seem harmless to us can leave lasting scars on someone else." Some teachers nodded in agreement, while others, including Grace, shifted uncomfortably. Grace felt like she was being targeted, but said nothing. After the meeting, Dr. Taylor approached Grace. "I know this situation has been difficult," he said, "but I believe there's an opportunity here to reflect and grow." Grace forced a smile. "Of course, I'm always open to feedback." But as she walked away, her defensiveness deepened. Zara's therapy sessions became a lifeline. Her therapist encouraged her to focus on what she could control and to find ways to reclaim her confidence. Zara decided to channel her emotions into action. With Mia's help, she started a peer support group for students dealing with bullying or discrimination. The group, called Lift Each Other, quickly gained traction. Students from diverse backgrounds began sharing their experiences, creating a sense of solidarity. For the first time since the incident, Zara felt a glimmer of hope. She realized her story could inspire change, even if the journey was painful. One afternoon, Grace overheard two students discussing Zara's support group. "She's so brave," one said. "I can't believe Ms. Nolan didn't even apologize." The words stung. Grace had convinced herself that Zara was overreacting, but hearing it from students made her question her stance. She began to wonder if her actions or inactions had caused more harm than she'd realized. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She revisited the incident in her mind, finally acknowledging that her comment had been cruel. But the thought of apologizing terrified her. What if Zara rejected her? The next day, Grace found Zara after class. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" she asked. Zara hesitated but nodded. "I've been thinking about what happened," Grace began. "I realize now that what I said was hurtful. I'm sorry." Zara studied her, unsure of how to respond. Part of her wanted to accept the apology, but another part felt it wasn't enough. "I appreciate the apology," she said finally, "but it doesn't change what happened." Grace nodded, her expression heavy. "I understand. If there's anything I could do to make things right, please let me know." Zara didn't reply, leaving Grace to sit with the weight of her words. As Zara's support group gained visibility, the school community became more polarized. Some parents applauded the initiative, while others criticized it as divisive. Grace, once a respected teacher, found herself increasingly alienated. Dr. Taylor remained steadfast in his support for Zara's efforts. "Change isn't easy," he told his staff during a meeting, "but it's necessary." The fallout from the incident had ripple effects far beyond Zara and Grace. The school's culture was shifting, but not without resistance. Zara's journey of healing had begun, while Grace faced the uncomfortable reality of her actions. Both were on paths of reckoning, though the outcomes remained uncertain. The week following Grace's apology, tensions at Westfield High continued to rise. The school board became involved after several parents wrote letters demanding accountability for the incident. While some defended Grace, Others questioned her ability to foster a safe learning environment. Dr. Taylor met with the school board to address their concerns. This isn't just about one incident, he explained. It's about creating a culture where students feel seen and respected. The board agreed to implement additional training for staff, but stopped short of taking disciplinary action against Grace, citing a lack of formal complaints. For Zara, the board's decision felt like another betrayal. "It's like nothing I do matters," she told Mia. "They'll always protect her." Grace's confidence began to crumble. Parents stopped engaging with her during open house events, and colleagues avoided her in the staff lounge. Her once proud reputation as a favorite teacher was now overshadowed by whispers and sideways glances. At home, Grace vented to her husband, Mark. "I'm being treated like a criminal for one mistake," she said, her voice cracking. "I've given everything to this job." Mark sighed. "Maybe it's time to step back and think about why people are upset." Grace bristled. "I know why they've blown this out of proportion." But deep down, doubt had begun to creep in. Despite the setbacks, Zara threw herself in to lift each other. The group expanded quickly, with students sharing stories of racism, bullying, and microaggressions. Zara became a quiet leader, using her own experiences to encourage others to speak out. One day, a younger student named Kendra approached Zara after a meeting. "Thank you for doing this," she said. "I've always felt invisible here, but now I feel like I belong." Kendra's words reignited something in Zara. For the first time since the incident, she felt a sense of purpose. "Maybe I can make a difference," she thought. The local newspaper published an article on Zara's support group and the broader conversation it had sparked about equity at Westfield High. The piece highlighted Zara's bravery while calling for systemic change in the district. Grace read the article with mixed emotions. The glowing praise for Zara made her feel small, but it also forced her to confront the impact of her actions. "If only I could go back and handle it differently," she thought. Meanwhile, the article drew attention from activists and community leaders, some of whom began attending school board meetings to advocate for change. The spotlight on Westfield High intensified. Grace's carefully guarded facade crumbled further when an old email she'd written years ago was leaked. The email, sent to a colleague during a diversity training session, contained dismissive remarks about the program. "More feel-good nonsense," she'd written. "Does anyone actually believe this change? Anything?" The email ignited outrage. Parents and students who had defended Grace began questioning their support. For Grace, the fallout was swift. Her inbox flooded with messages condemning her, and her principal placed her on probation pending further review. Dr. Taylor struggled to remain impartial. Though he hadn't sought Grace's downfall, the email confirmed what he had suspected. Grace's biases ran deeper than a single incident. Encouraged by the community's support, Zara took a bold step. She agreed to speak at the next school assembly about her experience and the importance of empathy and inclusion. "This isn't just about me," she told her parents. "It's about everyone who's ever felt invisible." The day of the assembly, Zara stood on the stage, her hands trembling. She glanced at Mia in the audience, who gave her an encouraging thumbs up. Taking a deep breath, Zara began. "When I came to this school, I hoped to find a place where I could thrive. Instead, I found myself in a situation that made me feel small and ashamed. But I've learned that my voice matters, and so does yours." Her speech was met with a standing ovation, even from some of Grace's former allies. Zara's words echoed through the hallways long after the assembly ended. Watching Zara's speech from the back of the auditorium, Grace felt a pang of regret. She remembered the bright, eager student Zara had been on the first day of school and realized how much she had dimmed that light. That evening, Grace sat alone in her living room, scrolling through the comments on the leaked email. Some were cruel, others insightful, but all painted a picture of someone she no longer recognized. When did I become this person? She wondered. For the first time, Grace admitted to herself that she needed to change not for the sake of her job, but for the sake of the students she claimed to care about. Dr. Taylor announced a series of new initiatives, including a mentorship program for marginalized students and a student-led equity council. He also implemented mandatory bias training for staff, using real-life examples though anonymized to highlight the harm caused by microaggressions. Change starts with accountability, Dr. Taylor said at a press conference. We owe it to our students to create an environment where everyone can succeed. The initiatives were met with cautious optimism. Some teachers embraced the changes, while others resisted. But for Zara, the progress felt like a step in the right direction. In the weeks that followed, Zara continued to thrive. Her artwork was displayed in the school's gallery, and she began applying for early college programs. One afternoon, Grace approached Zara in the hallway. "Zara, can we talk?" Zara hesitated but nodded. Grace's tone was softer than she had ever heard. "I know I can't undo what I did," Grace said, "but I want you to know I'm proud of the person you are. You've shown more courage than I ever could." Zara studied her for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "But courage isn't about what happens to you, it's about what you do next." Grace nodded, her eyes glistening. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. The fallout from the incident had reshaped Westfield High. Zara emerged as a leader, her voice inspiring others to confront uncomfortable truths. Grace, though humbled, began a slow journey of self-reflection. For the school community, the event served as a reminder that progress is messy but essential. Westfield High School started to feel different. Dr. Taylor's initiatives began to take root as teachers and students slowly adjusted to the new programs. The Student-Led Equity Council, Lift Each Other, expanded under Zara's guidance, involving not just students but parents and community members. Grace, meanwhile, returned to teaching after her probation, humbled but determined to change. She avoided the spotlight, instead focusing on rebuilding trust with her students. Though the road ahead was long, Grace quietly committed to unlearning her biases. Zara stood in the art room, admiring the mural she and other students had painted as part of Lift Each Other. The piece depicted students of all backgrounds holding hands, their faces turned toward a brighter future. For Zara, it was more than art, it was a symbol of the community's resilience. Her confidence had grown since the incident, bolstered by therapy and the support of her peers. She found herself smiling more, even laughing, though the scars of her experience lingered. "I'm not just surviving," she told me one day. "I am thriving." Despite her efforts to improve, Grace still faced resistance. Some students refused to speak to her in class, and her colleagues remained distant. Even Linda, her closest friend, had become less warm. During a quiet lunch break, Grace approached Linda. "Do you think I can ever make things right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Linda sighed. "I think it starts with listening not just to your students, but to yourself. Why do you feel the need to control everything?" Grace didn't have an answer. She realized she had spent years projecting her insecurities onto others, masking it as authority. Determined to make amends, Grace began attending the Equity Council meetings. At first, she stayed in the back taking notes but not speaking. Gradually, she started contributing, sharing her own journey of self-reflection. One evening, Zara noticed Grace at a meeting. Their eyes met briefly before Zara returned to the discussion. Though they didn't speak, Grace felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. Zara's leadership extended beyond Westfield High. Her story caught the attention of a local nonprofit dedicated to youth empowerment, which invited her to speak at a community event. Nervous but excited, Zara prepared a speech about overcoming adversity and building bridges. At the event, Zara's words resonated deeply. "Change isn't easy," she said. "It's messy and uncomfortable. But if we're willing to listen, we can create a world where everyone feels seen." The audience gave her a standing ovation, solidifying her role as a voice for change. Inspired by Zara's speech, Grace wrote a heartfelt letter to Zara, apologizing again and acknowledging the harm she had caused. This time, the letter wasn't about seeking forgiveness, it was about taking responsibility. She slipped the letter into Zara's locker with a simple note. No response needed. "Just wanted you to know." When Zara read the letter later that day, she felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and a glimmer of hope. Though she wasn't ready to forgive fully, she appreciated Grace's sincerity. Dr. Taylor's leadership transformed Westfield High into a model for inclusivity. The mentorship program matched students with supportive adults, fostering relationships that built confidence and resilience. The Equity Council's initiatives became a template for other schools in the district. At home, Dr. Taylor watched Zara flourish with pride. "You've done more than I ever could," he told her one evening. "You've shown this community what true strength looks like." Zara smiled. "I learned from the best." Grace found herself reflecting on Zara's journey. One afternoon, she stood before her class, preparing to discuss To Kill a Mockingbird. Instead of her usual lecture, she opened the floor to a discussion about injustice and accountability. "What does it mean to stand up for what's right?" she asked. The students hesitated before one raised a hand. "It means being willing to admit when you're wrong," he said. Grace nodded. "Exactly. And it's never too late to start." The turning point for Westfield High marked the beginning of a new chapter for its students and staff. Zara continued to lead with grace and determination, while Grace slowly rebuilt her sense of purpose. Though the road to healing was far from over, the seeds of change had been firmly planted. Though Grace attended Equity Council meetings and worked to improve herself, the weight of her reputation still bore down on her. Parents continued to request their children be transferred out of her class, and colleagues avoided sitting near her during staff meetings. Her once thriving career felt irreparably damaged. One night, Grace sat at her dining table, staring at a stack of papers to grade. Her mind drifted to Zara's speech at the assembly, the pride in her voice, the courage in her words. Grace envied that courage. "I've lived my life afraid of being wrong," she realized, "but being afraid doesn't excuse the harm I've done." Grace's personal life began to unravel alongside her professional struggles. Her husband, Mark, noticed her growing detachment. "You barely talk to me anymore," he said one evening. "I don't know what to say," Grace admitted. "I feel like a failure. Everyone sees me as this monster." Mark hesitated. "You're not a monster, Grace. But you've made mistakes. Maybe it's time to focus less on how others see you and more on how you see yourself." His words stayed with her. For the first time, Grace considered that her need for validation had blinded her to the impact of her actions. While Grace struggled, Zara soared. Her leadership in Lift Each Other continued to inspire change at Westfield High and beyond. She was invited to join a citywide youth advisory council, where she shared ideas for improving equity in schools. At one meeting, Zara met students from other schools who had faced similar challenges. Their stories fueled her determination to keep pushing for progress. "We're stronger together," she told them. "Our voices matter." Zara's parents watched her growth with pride. "She's finding her path," Dr. Taylor said, "and she's making the world better for others." One day, Grace was asked to substitute for another teacher during a faculty workshop. She hesitated but agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to prove herself. The workshop included role-playing exercises to address microaggressions in the classroom. When it was Grace's turn to lead a scenario, her attempt to use humor backfired. A comment she made about walking on eggshells these days was met with audible gasps. Though she hadn't intended harm, the remark reignited criticism. The next day, an email chain circulated among staff, dissecting her comment. Grace felt the familiar sting of judgment and began to question whether she had any place in the profession. Dr. Taylor called Grace into his office after hearing about the workshop incident. "I know you're trying," he said, his tone measured. "But trying isn't enough if you're not willing to examine your blind spots." Grace bristled at first, but knew he was right. "I don't know how to fix this," she admitted. "It starts with humility," Dr. Taylor replied. "And it doesn't happen overnight. You have to be willing to do the work, even when no one's watching." Grace nodded, though doubt lingered in her heart. Despite her struggles, Grace found small moments of progress. A student who had once avoided her class approached her after a lecture on Of Mice and Men. "I like how you explained Lenny's perspective," the student said. "It made me think differently." The compliment, though minor, gave Grace a sliver of hope. "Maybe I can still make a difference," she thought. "If I can stop worrying about how I'm perceived and focus on the students, maybe things can change." As Zara prepared for her senior year, she faced a major decision: whether to accept an early admission offer from a prestigious art school or stay at Westfield High to continue her work with Lift Each Other. During a family dinner, Zara expressed her uncertainty. "I feel like I'm abandoning everyone if I leave," she said. Her mother reached across the table, taking Zara's hand. "You've already done so much, sweetheart. Sometimes the best way to help others is to follow your dreams. You can still make a difference, no matter where you are." Zara nodded, feeling a sense of clarity. "I could do both," she thought. "I could take what I've learned here and carry it with me." Grace's probationary period ended, but the scars of her actions remained. When the district reviewed her teaching contract, they decided not to renew it, citing concerns about her ability to rebuild trust. The news devastated Grace. She packed up her classroom in silence, avoiding the eyes of her colleagues. As she carried the last box to her car, she passed the mural Zara had helped create. For a moment, she stopped to admire it. A tear slid down her cheek. "I failed them," she whispered. "But maybe this is where I start over." On her last day at Westfield High, Zara hosted one final meeting for Lift Each Other. She thanked everyone for their support and encouraged them to keep pushing for change. "This group isn't about one person," she said. "It's about all of us. Keep lifting each other up." The students presented Zara with a framed sketch of the mural, a reminder of the legacy she had built. Tears filled her eyes as she hugged Mia. "Thank you for always being there," she said. "Always," Mia replied. Months later, Grace began working as a substitute teacher in a neighboring district. Though her new role lacked the prestige she once enjoyed, it gave her a fresh start. She approached each day with quiet determination, focusing on listening rather than leading. One afternoon, she found herself in a classroom filled with artwork. Among the pieces was a familiar style Zara's. Grace smiled faintly. "She's out there making a difference," she thought. "And maybe in my own way I can too." Grace's journey ended in bittersweet reflection, while Zara's story continued to unfold with promise. The lessons learned at Westfield High rippled through the community, leaving behind a legacy of growth and resilience. Weeks after leaving Westfield High, Grace received a phone call from a former colleague. "You might want to check the news," the colleague said, her voice heavy with concern. Grace turned on her television and froze. A local news station had obtained and published the leaked email she had written years earlier during a diversity training session, calling it a chilling example of implicit bias in education. While her name wasn't mentioned outright, the context was unmistakable to anyone familiar with the incident at Westfield High. The story reignited public outrage. Grace's name trended locally on social media, with former students sharing their experiences of feeling dismissed or belittled in her class. While some defended her as a good teacher who made a mistake, others labeled her as emblematic of a larger problem in education. The fallout from the news story was swift. Grace's substitute teaching opportunities dried up, as schools became wary of associating with her. Even her attempts to volunteer at local nonprofits were met with polite rejections. At home, Grace struggled with feelings of shame and isolation. Her husband, Mark, tried to comfort her. "This doesn't have to be the end," he said. "You can still turn things around." Grace shook her head. "No one wants to hear from me anymore. I'm the symbol of everything they hate." Mark frowned. "Then maybe it's time to stop thinking about what others want and focus on what you can do." Meanwhile, Zara thrived in her first semester at art school. Her professors praised her talent, and her peers admired her leadership skills. But every now and then, she thought of Grace. During a quiet moment in the studio, Zara sketched a scene from her time at Westfield, the classroom where it all began. The memories no longer felt as raw, but they still carried weight. She apologized, Zara thought. Maybe that's enough for her, but it wasn't enough for me. Zara decided to channel her feelings into her work, creating a series of pieces on resilience and the importance of confronting bias. The series garnered attention, even earning a feature in a local gallery. Grace learned about Zara's art feature through a mutual acquaintance. Though she wanted to see the exhibit, she couldn't bring herself to go. The thought of facing the community again filled her with dread. Instead, Grace watched a news clip of Zara's gallery opening. The segment included an interview with Zara, who spoke about her journey. "Art has helped me process everything I've been through," she said. "It's a way to tell my story and connect with others." Grace felt a pang of regret. "I could have supported her from the beginning," she thought, but I was too wrapped up in my own image to see her clearly. One rainy evening, Grace sat down with a notebook and began writing. The letter wasn't an apology, it was a reflection on everything she had learned since leaving Westfield. She recounted her struggles, her regrets, and her hope that Zara would continue to inspire others. "I don't expect forgiveness," Grace wrote, "but I want you to know that your courage changed me. I'm still learning, and I have you to thank for pushing me to do better." Grace sealed the letter in an envelope, but hesitated to send it. Instead, she placed it in a drawer, knowing Zara didn't know her closure. As time passed, Grace began working at a small educational consulting firm, focusing on training teachers in rural areas. The job wasn't glamorous, but it allowed her to quietly contribute to improving classroom environments. In one session, a young teacher asked her, "Why did you choose this work?" Grace paused before answering. "Because I've made mistakes," she said, "and I want to help others avoid making the same ones." The teacher nodded, and Grace felt a flicker of purpose return. Grace's story ended not in triumph, but in quiet acknowledgement of her flaws and the work still ahead. Zara, meanwhile, continued to rise, her art and advocacy leaving a lasting impact on the community. Though their paths diverged, the lessons from their shared experience rippled outward, shaping a legacy of accountability and growth. Zara's art series, titled Resilience in Color, gained widespread acclaim. The gallery owner extended the exhibition due to high attendance, and local media outlets continued to cover her story. Her pieces depicted vivid, emotional scenes inspired by her journey at Westfield High, moments of pain, growth, and empowerment. At the opening of her second exhibition, Zara delivered a speech. "This series isn't just about my experience," she said. "It's about showing others that their voices matter, that they can turn pain into power." Her words resonated with the audience, many of whom approached her afterward to share their stories. Zara realized she had become more than an artist, she was now a mentor and advocate for change. Inspired by her success, Zara began hosting workshops for high school students interested in art as a means of expression. During these sessions, she encouraged students to share their experiences and channel their emotions into their work. One student, a shy boy named Kevin, created a piece about feeling invisible in his large family. "No one's ever asked me about this before," he told Zara. "That's the power of art," Zara replied. "It lets you tell your story, even when words feel too hard." The workshops became a cornerstone of Zara's mission, bridging the gap between art and activism. Months after leaving Westfield High, Zara returned to visit her family. While walking through the neighborhood, she passed the school and saw the mural she had helped create with Lift Each Other. It was slightly faded but still vibrant, a testament to the resilience of the community. Mia joined her, smiling at the sight of the mural. "You left your mark here," Mia said. "People still talk about what you did." Zara felt a pang of nostalgia. "I couldn't have done it without everyone's support," she said. "It was never just about me." Dr. Taylor's initiatives continued to thrive at Westfield High. The Equity Council remained active, and new programs were introduced to address systemic issues. Students who had once been overlooked now found a voice through the mentorship programs. At a school assembly, a teacher spoke about Zara's impact. "Her bravery reminded us that change is possible when we listen and act with empathy," he said. "She showed us how to be better." Though Zara wasn't present, her influence was felt in every corner of the school. Her story had become a catalyst for lasting change. Zara's work at art school evolved into a multimedia project combining visual art, storytelling, and spoken word. Her professors encouraged her to apply for prestigious fellowships, and she was accepted into a program focused on using art to address social issues. During a fellowship event, Zara met activists and artists from around the world. Their stories inspired her to think bigger. "Art can't fix everything," she said during a panel discussion, "but it can open hearts and minds, and that's where change begins." One day, while sorting through her mail, Zara found an envelope addressed to her. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but as she opened it, she realized it was from Grace. The letter was brief but heartfelt, acknowledging Grace's ongoing journey of self-reflection and thanking Zara for being a catalyst for her growth. Zara reread the letter several times. While she didn't feel compelled to respond, The gesture brought her a sense of closure. She's trying, Zara thought. That's all I ever wanted to make her see. As Zara prepared for her next exhibition, she reflected on how far she had come. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something powerful, something she could use to inspire others. During a phone call with her father, Zara shared her plans for the future. I want to start a nonprofit, she said. A space where kids can use art to tell their stories. Dr. Taylor's voice brimmed with pride. You're going to change the world, Zara. I'm just getting started, she replied. Zara's journey from humiliation to empowerment showcased the resilience of the human spirit. Her story became a beacon of hope, proving that even in the face of adversity, growth and change are possible. While Grace's story served as a cautionary tale, Zara's legacy became a symbol of the power of empathy, art, and the courage to speak up. Grace settled into her new life as an educational consultant. Her days were quieter, spent visiting rural schools and training teachers on classroom management and inclusive practices. Though the work lacked the excitement of her former teaching career, it allowed her to reflect on the mistakes that had led her here. During one training session, a young teacher asked her, "What's the hardest lesson you've learned as an educator?" Grace hesitated before answering. That teaching isn't just about what you say, it's about what you don't say, too. Sometimes silence can hurt as much as words. Her honesty earned nods from the room, but Grace knew the weight of her past would never fully lift. One evening, Grace sat at her desk, sorting through papers, when she came across a printout of Zara's mural from Westfield High. The sight brought a lump to her throat. That mural represents everything I should have stood for, she thought. Unable to shake the memory, she wrote a journal entry about the incident that had forever changed her career. She detailed her biases, her defensiveness, and her eventual realization that teaching was as much about listening as it was about leading. I failed Zara, she wrote, but she succeeded in ways I never could. That's what matters. Months later, Grace attended an educational conference where Zara was a keynote speaker. Grace didn't plan to interact with Zara. She simply wanted to hear her speak. Zara's words moved the room. Change begins when we're willing to confront the parts of ourselves that make us uncomfortable, she said. It's not about perfection, it's about progress. After the talk, Grace approached Zara from a distance, hesitant to interrupt her conversations with attendees. Just as she was about to leave, Zara noticed her. Their eyes met briefly, and Zara offered a small nod, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement. For Grace, it was enough. Grace continued her work, dedicating herself to helping teachers avoid the pitfalls she had fallen into. At one school, she met a young black student who reminded her of Zara, quiet but perceptive, with a sharp wit. During a classroom observation, Grace noticed the student raising his hand repeatedly, only to be overlooked by the teacher. Afterward, Grace gently suggested ways the teacher could ensure all voices were heard. That kid's got potential, Grace said. Don't let him go unnoticed. The teacher nodded, taking her advice to heart. For the first time in years, Grace felt a sense of fulfillment. Months later, Grace received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Zara. I read your letter. It began, I appreciate your honesty and the effort you've made to change. I hope you continue to grow, not just for yourself, but for everyone you have the chance to influence. The letter ended with a simple line. Your actions hurt me, but your growth shows me that change is possible. Thank you for trying. Grace held the letter close, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't absolution, but it was a step toward healing. Grace spent the following years quietly working to improve educational equity. She never regained her former reputation, but she no longer sought external validation. Instead, she found peace in knowing she was making a difference, even if it went unnoticed. One afternoon, she visited an art gallery on a whim. To her surprise, one of Zara's pieces was on display. The painting depicted a storm clearing over a vibrant landscape, symbolizing renewal and growth. Grace stood before it for a long time, her heart full of gratitude and humility. Back at Westfield High, Dr. Taylor continued to implement programs inspired by Zara's vision. The Equity Council flourished, and the school became a model for other districts. Zara's influence extended far beyond her hometown. her story serving as an inspiration for students and educators nationwide. Meanwhile, Zara's nonprofit, Lift Through Art, became a haven for young creatives. Through her work, she reminded others that pain could be transformed into something beautiful. As Grace reflected on her journey, she realized the true lesson wasn't just about her mistakes, but about the power of resilience and accountability. She had lost much, but she had gained something more valuable: the ability to see herself clearly and commit to doing better. Zara, in her own reflections, acknowledged that while she couldn't change the past, she could shape the future. Her work proved that even in the face of adversity, one voice could spark a revolution. If you enjoyed this story and its powerful message about resilience, accountability, and the journey toward change, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more heartfelt and thought-provoking content. Hit the like button, leave a comment to share your thoughts, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Together, we can spark meaningful conversations and inspire positive change. Thank you for your support,